Food. Taste. You see, we have to be identified with certain foods in our life. We have to be identified with certain tastes, that they are good. That's why we have to have bad food. Most of us marry bad cooks. You know? We're always seeking out at the genetic level variety because that is the meat of our consciousness. Remember something about putting things into your body is that everything you put into your body, your mind grabs onto. Everything. Now, I'm an individual and I'm habitual in that. Individuals like to stay with something that they love. You can end up with the same diet all of your life, which makes you very restrictive to input from the outside. That's me. There are people that have these vast diets and all of this variety, and they can't make a decision. There's too many ways to turn because the chemistry changes the way the brain functions. Oh, it's why our minds screw us around all the time, all the time. So the 16th gate, in order to be able to identify with the 16th gate, they have to be able to offer you, the same taste so that you get it. In other words, the only way that they're going to be able to convince you is logically. They have to get you to take the experiment. It's like me telling you to live out the experiment of your type. You know, you can't do that for somebody, but you can't get anybody onto the collective bandwagon unless they're ready to identify with it. They have to be ready. Now, the way in which you make them ready is that you make them uncomfortable morally if they refuse. That's what the collective does. You know, you can't identify with me because you don't think right. You can't identify with me because you do not live right. You can't identify with me because you cannot understand me. And it goes on and on and on and on. After all, this is all about the binary and judgment as a way to get other people to be the same, on the same side as you, so that you judge the same things in the same way. I mean, this is how the collective bonds. Have you ever seen any of these marches in Washington? You know, you have a cause that is the glue. But you know, it's made up of many diverse parts in the collective. It's the glue that holds that together. As long as they all have something to identify with in common, they'll forgive each other their other sins. At least in that context, for that moment, to deal with that situation. But you can never escape the underlying morality. And of course, it says to us that morality is part of our security system. I mean, it's part of what protects us. You know, and of course our society is based on the good ones being protected from the bad ones. You know, we have all of that. The spleen. In looking at the spleen and in looking at these two streams of the spleen, notice something. The tribal aspect of that. The tribal aspect of that is a projected aspect unless the ego can get to the throat. In other words, the two channels that make up the lower part of that stream, they end up in the ego at the 26th gate. That's very different than looking at the collective logic in which that stream is a manifesting stream. So important to be clear about the responsibility of logic to inform. I mean, it is a responsibility of logic to inform before it experiments. One of the things that frightens humanity the most is the mad scientist. You know, the person that right now is trying to clone a human being and hasn't told anybody. When logic does that, we get very upset. It has a manifesting potential. Now, we know that it's difficult for logic to get energy, but nonetheless, in this context, when you look at this stream is a manifesting stream. And it means ultimately that you cannot get people to identify with you unless you inform them first. Otherwise, they're going to resist you. So many people who are looking for grants, who are looking for government money, who are looking for financial support for their experiment, that they don't realize the simple mechanic of that. Because it's a simple mechanic. Getting others to identify with you. You know, this is the whole thing. It's the whole point. And that you're only going to get them to identify if you have the right strategy. First, what you have to do is inform them that you would like to try to, get them to see and identify with your experiment. But you can't just rush up to them and assume that they're going to fall in when you blurt all that in their face. You know, it's like these people in bar arguments who are always screaming about the government doesn't work. I mean, all of that's really nice and good, but it doesn't mean anything. The only time it means anything is when you have something that can replace it. When you have something that somebody else can identify with and see logically that it has a way of being able to solve that problem, move on in the pattern. But it's very different at the tribal level. And it tells you something so important about the tribe and its hot and cold. Is that the basic design of the tribe, without its leaders, without the 45-21, remember that's part of it. But just looking at the symmetry of dealing with two channels as streams, the thing to see that for the tribe, they have to be recognized. In other words, they have to see that there is a security cause. They're not there to be paranoid about the security cause. You know, they're there not to enter into battle lightly. They're there to be invited in that sense. They have to wait for those things to come to them. But the moment you bring the leaders, it changes. The moment you bring the 45-21, you bring the ego manifesting capacity. And that's one of the things to see about the tribe and the way that the smell operates, is that it operates differently in the leadership than it does in the tribal structure itself. The leadership has its own way. It's a manifesting way. And of course, if they don't inform the tribe where they're going to lead them, they have a problem. Now remember, manifestors don't have to wait for permission. But to eliminate resistance, they have to inform. So it's a key to see that in terms of logic, you have to let them know beforehand. And then you have a much better chance of getting them to identify with you. At the mundane level, that's saying to somebody, look, I think I understand what's the matter, but I don't want to tell you unless you want to hear that. So you let me know. Eh? That's a great logical pitch. Eliminates all the resistance. They don't think that you're an interfering, nosy son of a bitch. They don't have that need to back off. You've given them a way of saying, no thanks, I don't want to hear it. All of that's there. But you see, that's the gateway for logic to get somebody to be open to that experiment, open to getting them to identify. It was always so amusing for me how Eastern philosophy dumps on identification. And that's progress in the sense that if you're dumping on identification, and of course it's not that they really are, it's simply a matter of terms. To be awake means that you have to be unidentified in your identification. If you're carrying the 16th gate in your design, you have to be a passenger accepting that your vehicle identifies. It's not about getting lost in that identification. So many 16s get lost in identifying and then get terrified in that. because it can be a very uncomfortable place to be. It's also something else. Think about the fear that we're dealing with in the 48, the fear of inadequacy. This is what humanity is driven by at the judgmental level. You know, that we're inadequate. So no matter what we do, there's a part of the collective that tells us that. You know, here we are at the top of the food chain, and then we have to take all this flack about being cruel, savage, this and that, you know, we're lacking in God's grace. I mean, after all of religions basically are telling us that, you know, we have a hell of a lot of work to do, you know, in order to be able to meet those standards. Funny what drives us, eh? All this stuff. It's the tone of the world, after all. And it is what drives us along. Our sense of inadequacy, our fear that the authority may be wrong, that we may be guided in the wrong direction, that all of that is a deep, deep part of us. In order to keep us looking, in order to keep us repeating over and over again, okay, this is the way, this is the way, this is the way, this is the way. And getting everybody else to identify with it so everybody can say, okay, this is the way, this is the way. And the longer that the pattern lasts, eventually the tribe will take it in. And that's one of the things. You know, for example, the telephone. The collective would leap to that. Not the tribe. So you would have cities that were wired, and you would have villages where there was one phone. But the longer that pattern stayed stable, and the more in which that pattern became organized, so it became really efficient and useful and whatever and ever, eventually all of those tribal beings got their own phone. But the pattern has to be durable. It has to stay long enough. Remember, continuity means everything to the tribe. The tribe is never going to accept a collective fashion. You know, it doesn't want a flavor that's going to disappear. But what the tribe will look to in the collective is when the collective can establish something that's reliable and works. I mean, after all, the tribe allows its children to go into collective schools. And in a collective society like America, you can see that you're always going to have the backlash. You got all these people now that are funding private schools. You got all these people that want their little tribal secular school or non-secular school. You got the Catholic school and this and that and all these things. You know, this is the whole struggle for the planet. The struggle for the planet is the children. You know my pitch. Human design is tough for adults. Let's teach it to the kids, please. You know, learn from the collective. Teach the children. You teach the children. You change a generation. You change the way everything operates. That's why we have all these funny fatherlands and motherlands. You know, we have the collective always trying to assert its parenthood over all of us. That the collective and the logic will soothe us and warm us and protect us. And as long as we all agree with the prevailing morality, then everything is going to operate smoothly. The one thing left about the second tone is that out of its uncertainty, there is a restlessness in its spirit that you will always meet. And it doesn't matter whether or not in their process that they have a solid pattern that they can identify with, they will remain uncertain in that pattern. And it's something that you see as a cliche in the artist. The performing artist is an example. Logical art is about repetition in order to reach mastery. And yet, if you're caught up in repetition to reach mastery, it means that there is never satisfaction. Never. There is accomplishment, but not satisfaction. So the great musician that plays a concert, that musician will never, ever, ever walk off that stage saying, that was it. I mean, it's not possible. And so there's a restlessness in the spirit. There is this restlessness that is seeking a final perfection. Now here's where the joke comes in. If you take morality to its final perfection, you get Judgment Day. You get the good go to heaven and the bad go to hell. And it's over. You know, the good don't have to deal with the bad anymore. The bad don't have to deal with the good anymore. It's over. You know, you get to Judgment Day. But there's a joke in that. You get to death in that. I mean, that's what you get to. You just get to death. This is the stagnant way. If we ever get to the point of perfection, it's all over. We're never intended to get to the point of perfection. You know, this was Buddha's trip. He was such a jerk. I mean, really. Well, that was his trip, you know. We're going to get to the perfected state. That's death, Buddha. And of course, that's what he wanted. Get me out of the vehicle. Get me out of the chain. Get me out of the circle. You know, well, screw him. I mean, we all have to be in. There is no out. I mean, that's just a game. There's no out. Oh, there's annihilation. That's different. That's the waste paper basket. That's no more. But that's an evolutionary process. But this is the whole thing about what happens to you when you take judgment to its final place. You know, it's just death. And of course, this is why there's this restlessness in the spirit of the second tone. You know, it says, oh shit, this is going to go on forever. It's never going to stop. I'm never going to have a day where I can just sit back here and say, yeah, right, perfect. You know? This isn't a Bud commercial. It doesn't work that way. And so there's this restlessness. Now you can have all kinds of designs that are layered over the surface, eh? But underneath, if you're carrying this tone, there's this quality inside. And it's constantly saying, wait a minute, can't we just agree that this is the pattern and this is it? Oh, here this stuff and that, this is it. When they get to that point, you can see why the tribe and the collective have a way of meeting. You know, it's death for both of them to be fixed. It's death for all of us to be without mutation. Wherever we're going to look in the tones, remember that no specific tone carries with it the life force. That's in the acoustic. That's the thing that'll keep it going forever. But it's not in these sub-themes that are here per tone. We come to the third tone and the beginning of the Ajna binary. In the statistical research that is being done by Rave Life Sciences, we come across some hilarious things. And one of my favorite jokes, one of my best jokes so far, is a statistical study of the significance of centers in the 9-centered matrix. I don't want to go into the technical description of how that works. Basically what it is to find out initially if there are any centers that have no significance. Then of course the whole matrix breaks down. then to be able to see the graduated differences between significance. In other words, which centers are more significant than others. So we discovered that all of them are significant. That is, as we did with type, the 9-centered matrix stands up. But what was so fascinating was that on a scale of significance, the least significant center was the ajna. By the way, the real joke is that when we did the same analysis on the dream rave, that in the dream rave, where you may know that in our dreaming state, that's when we're totally involved in the non-personal. And in the dream rave, of course, the center that's the least significant is the G. So, in dealing with the ajna center, you know, it's one of these things, it's the great joke of what it is to be a human being. Here we are, you know, and here we have this wonderful mechanism, this mind of ours, but it is the least significant. It does not have inner authority. It is not going to be able to tell us what is correct for us to do, not do, all of those things. However, it is about us having the ability to store and communicate with each other the experience of existence. I mean, that is what it's about. You know, mind is there so that we can communicate, that we can interact, and that we can hold ourselves together as a whole. Because that's our main mechanism for holding ourselves together, is that through mind and through the collective mind, we are able to establish what is and what isn't the world. And you'll notice that when you get into the mind, you have nothing but the collective. You know, that's one of the things that separates the tribe from the collective so profoundly. I mean, the tribe is not into the mental trip. It's not what they're about. And of course, the collective is entirely into the mental trip. That's what they are about. You know. I have an old farmer friend of mine, shepherd in Ibiza. And whenever the moon was full, he would pump water. And I thought, geez, Antonio, you smart guy. You know, the moon's full. It takes less energy to pull the water up. You know, a good collective, logical concept. And I go over, I see him a couple of days down the road. I said, Antonio, I said, that's great. I said, I notice you're always pumping your water when the moon is full. He said, really? I mean, what the hell does the tribe care? You know. I mean, he knows when to pump his water. It's, you know, it's not a concept. It's not built on some logical calendar. It's not a, you know, it's not a matter of physics. You know, it's just operating through him. I'd tell another story, but this is on tape, and I wouldn't tell that story about him on tape. Anyway. Yeah, right. We'll wait till the break. Okay, so we've got the ajna binary. The first thing I want you to notice about this ajna binary is that the third tone is related to the logical process, and the fourth tone is related to the abstract process. That's the first thing to recognize in terms of looking at streams and understanding the way the streams work relative to the sense. Here you can see that the sense is the eyes.